Hey friends. Today I have just had in my awareness something that I actually spoke about a few days ago on my post, or I mentioned it in passing. And it comes out of this book that I'm now getting sort of almost towards the end of, on human meaning making, how we make meaning through narrative, and the role that story and story structure plays in the whole way we see the world and the identity that we perceive ourselves to have. All of that fascinating book, and it's called Erzählende Affen. It's in German. I don't know if it's been translated. It would be something like storytelling apes or storytelling monkeys if for the English title, unless they changed it. But one of the things that was mentioned almost in passing was the idea of narratives as the sort of anchor of identity is one of the themes that's being explored and unpacked throughout the book. And they're looking at very sort of in a way that I've never thought about it this way before, but they're looking at the narratives that have guided cultures in various locations on the globe and throughout various time periods. So in other words, we can look at the guiding story of America at the time of its founding, England at the time of the American Revolution, Germany in the period right before World War II, right before the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. They've now done a kind of, they've gone in some degree of depth into a variety of significant cultural moments, and really unpacked not just the history, but the sort of narrative that was most dominant in the culture. And it's kind of incredible when you do that, because it was very clear to me. I mean, I'm somebody who, I don't need a lot of convincing that this is how we think. I have done a lot of work in storytelling. I love observing how what our creative mind is doing is sort of falls into these archetypal structures that stories inherently have, as exhaustively explored and mapped by Joseph Campbell. So I take very little. I was a ripe audience for these ideas, and yet I just find it fascinating to really look at what the underlying stories likely were in various periods of history, and how when you see stories in that light, when you see identity, cultural identity or personal identity in that light, all of a sudden history makes total sense. It's like it makes the events of history very not predictable in the kind of scientistic way, but it makes it very evident why certain cultures and certain nations and whatnot kind of took certain tacks at various points in their history. And one of the ones that they've gone into pretty in depth recently, these are German writers. It's co-written by two authors, one of whom, Friedemann Karik, is a male German writer. I suspect he's a white German. And then the other one is a woman named Samira El-Wazil, who's half Moroccan, half something else, not German, but born in Germany, and has grown up with this Muslim identity, but in Germany. So she has a whole kind of multicultural experience, or a kind of, culture of estrangement experience within her home country, but again identifies as German. And so they're interested in German history. They probe pretty deeply into German history, and they've done a really what I most recently listened to was the section on pre-World War II Germany and the stories that were active at that point, that were animating the national identity, and that provided fertile soil for someone like Hitler to come in and provide a narrative that felt compelling. And in some ways they've gone on to talk about German history up to today, and there's some somewhat funny, if you're familiar with German culture, exploration of how German identity is kind of, basically they're saying that one of the central features of German identity is the search for an identity. The thing that's most typical German is that anything can be called typical German that doesn't, that sort of is something that people would rather like repel from themselves. And so the only sort of ultra consistent feature of typical Germanness is calling things typical German and the ongoing search for identity. Which I can't speak to that as being true, but having grown up in Germany, I definitely feel that. I can definitely see what they're talking about. But in this sort of pre-World War II, almost like era, there was almost like a vacuum of national narrative. What they were saying is the entire, the previous 20 generations of German identity had been kind of upended and rendered impotent by the defeat in World War I. And so there was this searching and this ripeness, and what they called a narrative homelessness, which I thought was a really interesting phrase. That's the phrase that I mentioned a few days ago on my post. But the idea of narrative homelessness really, really resonates with me as something that, it's a factor and it's a feature of transitions in broad cultural levels of consciousness. We can't generally spring, certainly as a culture, from embracing one narrative to immediately organizing at the next level of consciousness. There's usually some messiness involved. There's usually some loss of order and a bit of a chaotic flailing about. In the meantime, sometimes assuming substitute narratives, or one of the things they said today is that the German kind of vacuum, the German narrative vacuum, meant that the population was really kind of craving. They called it, they expressed it in German, but they called it basically a narrative that fulfilled identity in a sort of cheap way. So in other words, without too much imperative being placed on the people, without too much transformation being demanded. And if you saw my post from a couple of days ago, I was talking about this. One of the features of fascist narratives is that they put the hero, us, you, the population, they put us in the position of the hero, but they remove the classic, sort of central, in some ways, most pivotal moment of the hero's journey, which is the moment of the hero's transformation. So in other words, the hero is pursuing a goal, overcoming trials and tribulations and being stopped at every turn, all kinds of obstacles. And at some point, those obstacles or some kind of culmination in that quest results in the hero having to change their identity. So in other words, they don't just simply start and fight and fight and fight and prevail. They start and fight and fight and fight and fight, and then they hit a moment of truth, the moment of reckoning. In Hollywood screenplays, it's called the all is lost moment, when it seems that the hero has failed, and then the hero has a revelation about how they've been going about their quest and sometimes who they are. I mean, this manifests in all kinds of different ways, but that they transform, and it's in their willingness to shed an identity and assume a new identity, which of course in a movie or in a story happens in a compressed time frame, which then allows them to prevail and move on to the victorious finish, if it's a story with a happy ending. Or sometimes that moment of transformation happens, but it happens too late, and the hero fails, and then we have a tragic ending. But the transformation is generally there. Well, in fascist narratives, no transformation. The hero just starts and goes, and we're told that we will prevail if we will just keep fighting the bad people. What makes this sort of narrative palatable is a narrative vacuum, or narrative homelessness, the absence of a compelling sense of identity, who we are, a story we can tell ourselves that jibes with reality, that we see reflected, and a resulting kind of like casting about for a new way to explain who we are, and a new something that's going to empower us. And when I then take a look at it and I think about this idea of narrative homelessness as a form of vulnerability, and I consider that this is happening in the internet age, it's no wonder people are gravitating towards all kinds of narratives, all kinds of pseudo empowerment that give us the feeling that we know who we are and we know where we're going, and if we just keep doing what we're doing, then we will prevail, without the imperative, we must transform ourselves. We must rise above. We must go about this in a different way. The thinking that got us here isn't going to get us through this. The thinking that created the problem isn't going to solve the problem. That whole kind of Einsteinian adage. Putting these pieces together is the bit that's been sort of like flashing for me for the last couple of days. I've been going, oh wow! Now that I've been seated with this notion of narrative homelessness or a narrative vacuum, I look around and I see a lot of it. And I think what it does for me is it explains some of what I'm seeing. And as someone who I feel like I've had the fortune and the privilege to create a narrative for myself that's really compelling, where transformation is central and ongoing. It gives me a sense of, I don't know, I don't think responsibility is the right word, but it gives me a sense of wanting to help, I guess. Wanting to help and maybe also a sense of value in the personal spiritual quest, which is very individual, but which again, like narratives, consists of pretty archetypal stages. You know, in some of Sadhguru's books, he talks about being able to tell exactly where someone is in their journey, knowing exactly what part of the unfolding someone is at, because I think he's just developed an insane level of sensitivity and perspective and consciousness. So, but making that journey somehow culturally relevant feels like it could be significant and helpful to a condition of kind of narrative void. So that's what's on my mind today, folks. Book's almost over, but you're probably going to be hearing about it for a while. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.